Hi, Dale Weaver. Hello, Kenneth Brown. Hi, Devora. And hi, Dolores Pierce. Thank you all for coming. And please tell me if my sound and picture is all right. I'd certainly appreciate that. Dale tells me good evening. Dale says sounds fine and looks great. Well, thank you, Dale. I appreciate that. I'm very glad to know it. Okay, so of course you all know that the CNN Climate the Town Hall is going on this evening. Uh, 7 hour extravaganza, or is it a 5 hour extravaganza? But anyway, the candidates are not allowed by the DNC to appear on the same stage together. So each one appears in sequence here and gives their views on what ought to be done about climate change. Uh, so this setup is in some ways a very interesting sort of setup. But one striking thing that I noticed about this is that the way CNN is dishing it up to the public to see the town hall, to see it fully live in all the detail, you have to have a service provider that features live TV from CNN. Now, you can go to CNN.com if you don't have such a provider. And you can see clips of each of the candidates as they make some key points. Of course, the key points are evaluated by the CNN personnel themselves. So they're deciding what the key points are to feed to people. And every few minutes, they're giving some updates where they give a little clip about the town hall. And of course, they're selecting the clip. And then they're also doing a summary of the views of the candidates as expressed in the town hall. And of course, it's their summary. So for those who want to watch the full version and who don't have a service provider who's giving them full CNN as a live stream, you are stuck and have to rely on their sound bites and their summaries, which, of course, based on previous history in the campaign, are likely to be biased towards certain candidates and biased against certain other candidates. Now, I'm sure the news will be full of such bias in the coming days. Okay. But for now, it's too soon to give you the bias, because not everyone who would do so is actually using a service provider that has the live CNN. So that's the situation here. Okay. So there are a few things that you should be learning from this town hall, or this really series of serial town halls which are going on here. Hey Russell, how you doing? Nice to see you. Okay, and hi Dolores, if I haven't already said hi to you. Hi. And also Devora, if I haven't said hi to you, and Bonnie, if I haven't said hi to you. Hi. So anyway, what's okay? So there are two things, okay, that you have to be clear on. First, of course, what you want to get is the individual views, okay, of all the candidates. But then what you want to get is the overall pattern of what's going on when you look at all the candidates put together. And that's a little harder to evaluate. Okay. Uh, it's a little harder to evaluate from the CNN summaries because you're not certain about what but CNN has chosen to emphasize and has neglected to emphasize. Okay, so to help you along, what I'm going to do is suggest that you ought to be looking, when you get a chance, at a Huffington Post article, which I've linked to in the description, which provided a cheat sheet with, of course, the bias of the Huffington Post, okay, included in the cheat sheet before the climate change or climate emergency or climate crisis town halls actually occurred. The cheat sheet was written, as I say, prior to the town halls. I think sometime earlier today. And what you learn from the cheat sheet is, of course, the specifics of the views of each person going into the town hall. But what you also learned is the general pattern, okay, of where things are. Let's now share. Oh, by the way, tonight's in-depth show is being live streamed on behalf, okay, of New Macro Media, because, of course, this is a very political stream rather than a relatively non-political stream. But what I'm going to do now is share the cheat sheet that I've spoken about. And so the cheat sheet kind of gives you a very, very broad summary of what the candidates have so far said in the campaign. The overall idea, okay, of Biden's proposals, for example, is to decarbonize the economy by mid-century. So one's immediate reaction to that is to think, Uh-oh, that's likely to be too late. Uh, the cost of that is supposed to be 1.7 trillion over a decade, but Biden hopes private, state, and local investments bring the figure to more than 5 trillion. I suppose that figure of more than 5 trillion is what actually produces the jobs that are promised of more than about 10 million, because the government expenditures advocated by Biden are only 170 billion a year, hardly enough to handle a crisis as big as uh, the Second World War. But anyway, the highlights of his plan, okay, are made clear in the cheat sheet. Uh, and a little statement what the wonks actually criticize. And of course, the wonks say the campaign addresses fossil fuels in only vague terms. And Biden, whose campaign includes a former natural gas executive, made clear that fossil fuels could still play a role when sparring on the debate stage. So, and zero emissions, okay, in other words, having net zero emissions, Biden says no later than 2050. That really, really sounds like it's too late. The ranking by advocates, by Greenpeace and 350 Action, okay, and Data for Progress, thought this plan was a thorough plan. I don't know on what basis they came up with that. They gave it thumbs up, okay, or 350 Action did. Okay, I have no idea how they came up with that, but they seem to think that was thorough. My view of it is it seems like it's neither thorough nor sufficient, and is far too late in terms of the achievement, okay, of its goals. Next, we have Cory Booker. And Cory Booker threw his support behind the Green New Deal last year and signed on to the resolution. And he has a focus on minority communities that are poor communities and that often suffer the worst of the pollution. And his plan costs 3 trillion by 2030, and of course he's very vague about the millions of jobs that would come about, okay, as a result of that. He wants to ban fossil fuel drilling and fracking. He supports a ban on that. And he wants to end subsidies to the fossil fuel companies, and he supports a ban on that. The plan calls for establishing a 50 billion per year by U.S. Environmental Justice Fund, charged with coordinating the most ambitious ever federal effort to advance environmental justice and invest in communities long left behind. It also prioritizes protecting and restoring public lands. And the criticism of the wonks? The plan lacks details. Wow. Pretty serious criticism. And risks being overshadowed by Newark's lead contamination process. And it zeroes out emissions, 100% carbon neutral economy by 2045, and ranking by advocates A minus. Greenpeace, they lost their minds. 350 action, three thumbs up, and data for progress have very thorough. On what basis? On what basis is this thorough? Then there's a plan that's by okay. There's a plan by Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, and he thinks he has a unique appreciation of the threat because he's only 37. But still, he's taken a piecemeal approach to climate policy so far. He joined calls for establishing a national climate corps, and he backs a climate tax and a dividend scheme, and promised to at least quadruple federal research spending on renewable power and energy storage technology. Thereby, he's going to provide a lot of jobs for people who already have jobs and who make fairly good livings to start with. And the cost he has in mind is 2.5 trillion over 10 years, 250 billion that is per year, and he thinks that's going to produce 3 million jobs. So I guess we have to look at his plan in detail and see how he comes up with the 3 million jobs. He wants to ban fossil fuel drilling on public lands, fracking. He wants to support a ban, but only on new fracking, not on existing fracking, I guess, or ongoing fracking, or old fracking. Subsidies to fossil fuel companies. He supports a ban on that. What stands out? The plan calls for net zero emissions for all new heavy duty vehicles, buses, rail, ships, and aircraft by 2040, including airplanes. That's a unique goal, given how far behind electric planes are compared to other forms of electrified vehicles. So that is interesting. But again, the net zero emissions by 2040 is probably way too late. The plan promises a thriving carbon removal industry by 2040, and he hints that he would pay farmers to sequester carbon, but it lacks detail, and as it's worded, leaves open the possibility of carbon capture to support continued use of fossil fuels. He doesn't want to zero out emissions until 2050. Greenpeace gave that a B, 350 action, two thumbs up, and Data for Progress said it was a thorough plan. And then there's Julian Castro. He wants to focus on drinking water infrastructure, wants to overhaul that. He wants to combat the sort of contamination of water that we find, in Newark and in Flint, Michigan, and in other poor communities of color. His camp focuses on communities of color and adds extra weight to his justice centered proposals. And the cost estimate, 10 trillion in public and private investment. So that's a little squirrely because, of course, he can't supply the private investment. So, just how much is there going to be in public investment alone? We don't know from this particular summary. I suppose it could mean only $1 trillion in public investment, or maybe 2 trillion, or maybe 3 trillion. And I'd like to know how he gets to by 10 million jobs. He wants to ban fossil fuel drilling on public lands. His position on fracking is unclear. He wants to support a ban on subsidies to fossil fuel. By the way, that's really low-hanging fruit. He wants to create a new climate he wants to create a new climate refugee status and establish a program to resettle migrants from low-lying islands. And that carries, okay, some extra weight because I guess he's the only one to propose that. And what the Wongs have to say about it is they say the plan's economic guarantee for fossil fuel workers offers few details, despite being pivotal to winning support for the policy. It also makes no mention of what's going to happen with nuclear power. It zeroes out emissions by 2045 with at least 50% cuts in emissions by 2030. So the 2030 is fairly ambitious compared to some. The 2005 is not so ambitious compared to others. It was given a B by Greenpeace, and 350 Action gave it 2 thumbs up, and Data for Progress said it was a thorough plan. I think when Data for Progress says it's a thorough plan, I think what they're probably saying is that it's a fairly detailed plan. I don't think that's necessarily a statement of approval for the plan. Next, there's Kamala Harris. She was among the last to release a climate plan. In fact, her latest one only came out early this morning, just ahead of the forum, okay, the town halls. So she leaned heavily on existing legislation, like the Climate Equity Act she co-sponsored with Ocasio-Cortez, as well as Jeff Merkley's bill to transition to zero emissions vehicles. And she estimated it at a cost of 10 trillion in unspecified public and private spending over the next 10 years. To me, such cost estimate means nothing. It doesn't say what exactly the government is going to spend. It doesn't really say how it'll be possible to get the private sector to spend a good part of that average $1 trillion a year. She's vague about the job creation she's promising. Well, she'll say, okay, it's in the millions. She supports a ban on fossil fuel drilling on lands owned by the public. Her stand on fracking is unclear. Her subsidies to fossil fuel companies, she supports a ban. Her proposal prominently features a promise to designate 30% of U.S. land and ocean for conservation. I'm not quite sure what that exactly means, but it probably means that she's not going to give it over to ranchers, and she's probably not going to give it over to the oil companies for more fracking. What the wonks criticize, sorry, the wonks, I said wonks. The plan breaks little new ground. It also touts Harris's record of holding police accountable as California's Attorney General, but under her leadership, the Golden State's top law enforcement officer failed to join investigations in New York and Massachusetts into the efforts of the oil giants to obscure the realities of climate change. That is Kamala, right? Anyway, she wants to zero out emissions by 2005. She got a ranking from Greenpeace of, she got B plus from Greenpeace, and from 350 Action, she got 2 thumbs up. And Data for Progress said her plan was thorough. See, now I'm even less sure what thorough means, because it seems to me, based on the summary and based on what I've read of her plan so far, I did do a little scanning of it this morning as soon as it came out, and it seemed to me to be detailed, seemed to me to be a long plan, but it also seemed to me to be not very thorough, to gloss over details and to be vague, and in that way to be a typical Kamala plan. Next is Amy Klobuchar. Her cost is 1 trillion, and the jobs she promises are unspecified. She's going to ban fossil fuel drilling on public lands, but fracking, she doesn't support a ban. She doesn't want to give subsidies to fossil fuel companies, though. So she's 2 out of 3. Okay, but she only wants to spend $1 trillion over 10 years for a problem that's as serious as World War II. She only wants to spend $100 billion a year on our survival efforts. Wow. What stands out? While she lets an unspecified call for a Green New Deal do the heavy lifting on her proposal, Amy Klobuchar promises a carbon pricing scheme that does not have a regressive impact on Americans. Well, that's nice. What the wonks criticize is it's vague and light on details. Well, I agree. Based on this summary, it's vague and light on details. She wants to zero out the emissions by 2050. Bye-bye, world. Bye-bye, world. Ranking by advocates. Greenpeace says C+, and 350 Action says 2 thumbs up, and Data for Progress says incomplete. Oh, incomplete. So at least one person got an incomplete. That's good. We kept on getting thorough evaluations from Data for Progress. I was kind of wondering what happened to them. During the former Texas congressman's bid to unseat Ted Cruz, he bolstered his state's oil and gas industry. He touted his record of voting to lift the export ban on oil and gas. After a kerfuffle with activists, in which he signed the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge, he violated it and then renewed his commitment. His campaign became the first to release a comprehensive climate plan. The proposal, which helped set the tone for other campaigns, lays out a plan to make the United States carbon neutral by mid-century. He costs it out as 1.5 trillion over a decade, but O'Rourke hopes to spur at least 4 trillion in related spending. So in other words, he's postulating there's going to be a multiplier of 3.0 on the 1.5 trillion or 150 billion a year he plans to spend. Well, we have to note here that such a multiplier is going to largely depend upon how much he taxes away and who he taxes it away from. If he wants to pay for it all, he's not going to get a multiplier of 3.0. I can tell you that. He'll be lucky if he gets a dollar for dollar fiscal multiplier on that. His jobs promise is unspecified. He doesn't even want to guess about that. He supports a ban on fossil fuel drilling on public lands. Question is, does he support a ban on selling public lands to fossil fuel people so they can then frack on it or drill on it? And he supports a ban when it comes to fracking, but only on new fracking. Current fracking and old fracking, creating earthquakes in California and other places, that's just fine. Subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. He supports a ban. What stands out? The plan calls for establishing first ever net zero emissions by 2030, a carbon budget for federal lands. Well, that's really pretty good, but just how the hell is he going to do that when he's not spending any money? And requiring all federal permitting decisions to fully account for climate costs and for community impacts. In other words, he can't get net zero emissions by 2030 without the government spending a lot of money to facilitate the transition to net zero. And he's only got $150 billion a year specified for that. What the Wongs criticize, the plan's vagueness. Well, that's Beto, Mr. Vagueness. And then Inslee, Governor Inslee, who put tackling the climate crisis at the center of his 2020 bid before dropping out of the race last month, called the plan empty rhetoric. That's Beto, and said O'Rourke will need to answer why he did not lead on climate change in Congress. Yeah, in Congress he sat right next to Tulsi. And he didn't support her off the Fossil Fuels Act. He didn't. He wants to zero out emissions by 2050. Well, you know what I think about that. Bye-bye, world. Bye-bye, Beto. Unfortunately, bye-bye us. And Greenpeace, who is an easy grader, gives him a grade of B-, and 350 Action, 2 thumbs up. They must be easy to buy off, too. And Data for Progress says thorough. Based on criticism from others, I don't know how that can be thorough. It can't be both thorough and vague enough to have gotten a condemnation from Inslee, from Jay Inslee. Anyway, as you all know already, the most ambitious but Green New Deal plan in scope and spending is Bernie Sanders' plan. And the plan is also unique in how it finances its budget, in its proposals to redistribute wealth, and in its ideas to right the original New Deal's racist and sexist legacy. His estimated cost is 16.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Okay, by the way, I really disagree with this estimate. Of course, okay, it's an estimate that begins to get at the scale of the problem. But but I'd like you to please believe me. If the likely cost, okay, of Medicare for all is going to be $28 trillion, let's say, over 10 years in constant dollars, then the likely cost of an effort that will rival World War II in scale is going to be at a minimum 35 trillion and maybe 50 trillion. And you know what? It doesn't matter how much it is, because this is about spending the necessary money or dying. It doesn't matter how much it costs, especially not for a monetary sovereign. Bernie promises 20 million jobs by creating. Now that's over 10 years. He's going to add 20 million jobs. Remember, over 10 years, the population is probably going to be increasing by 10 million people. I think Bernie's going to need more like 35 trillion jobs. And I also think Bernie's going to provide the 35 million jobs through his job guarantee program and through certain other programs. I think he's under-promising here. Anyway, going on, fossil fuel drilling on public lands, he supports the ban. Fracking, he supports a ban. On subsidies to fossil fuel companies, he supports a ban. Something else, which they didn't ask. Does he support a ban on fracking? On fossil fuel drilling altogether on both public and private lands? I'll bet you he does. I'll bet you he does. I don't recall if he does, but I bet money that he does. That under Bernie, there's going to be a ban on fossil fuel drilling, period. Period. Now what stands out? Sanders would use military cuts and tax hikes on the wealthy to pay for the plan. Correction, please. He's going to use military cuts and tax hikes to create further policy space for the plan to counter inflationary tendencies that may be created by the plan. But he's not going to use that to pay for the plan, because Bernie is probably the only one who really knows, the only one of all the candidates who really knows how this plan is going to be paid for. And it's going to be paid for through money creation by the federal government under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Because the chief economic advisor of Bernie Sanders knows exactly how to do that and exactly how to sell that to the public. When Bernie is president, that's going to happen. Anyway, What also stands out is that the plan also includes a blueprint to nationalize electricity production and expand public and worker-owned grocery stores and food processing plants. That does stand out. But what also stands out is the sheer detail of the plan and the sheer thoroughness of the plan. What the Wongs criticize, Sanders' firm stance against nuclear power and carbon capture technology jeopardizes a focus on emissions cuts. I don't see how that criticism is a justified criticism because the objective is not simply emissions cuts, it's also survival. And the main problem with nuclear power technology is that we still don't have a way to handle nuclear waste, which is safe for the environment. Until we do, it stands against that kind of power. Isn't a bug in his plan. It's a feature. And as far as carbon capture technology is concerned, the geoengineering schemes that would be used to do that are not things that he's in favor of, but they're arguments against that kind of technology. And those arguments are that it involves financing a new industry that involves very heavy investments in technology and very heavy investments in very large companies that would again form power sectors to essentially undermine our democracy and dominate our politics. And we don't even know if that kind of carbon capture technology would be that effective yet. But also, and more importantly, Bernie does support agricultural carbon capture technology that through regenerative agriculture would provide for carbon capture into the soils of the world. It's in his Green New Deal plan. He supports that. That part is not as detailed as some other aspects of his plan. But the kind of thing that involves a bottom up effort by small farmers and a bottom up effort by small business to rely on natural means of carbon capture would be the most reliable form of carbon capture technology and the kind of carbon capture that is least likely to have damaging side effects. He wants to zero out emissions, by the way, by 2030 for electricity and transportation, and by 2050 for the full economy. I don't recall the 2050 from his green by New Deal plan that he recently released. I will double check that. But I think he's attempting to zero out emissions by much before that. Not much past 2030, if I remember correctly. But I will double check that for you and report on that in comments or in future live streams. Anyway, the ranking by Greenpeace is an A. By 350 Action, it's 3 thumbs up. And by Data for Progress, it's very thorough. So, let's look at an emerging picture from here. The emerging picture is that there are a bunch of candidates who feel they have to say something about the climate, but the scale of their commitments to action by the government to help us do that belies the seriousness of their approach. They're basically saying, okay, I want to do something, but I don't really believe this threatens our existence. And the reason why I say that is because if they did believe it, they wouldn't be trying to come out with plans which are very small ball compared to Bernie's plan. But that's the pattern we see. Everybody feels they have to say something about the climate, but very few people seem to feel they have to solve the climate emergency problem. The only one thus far who seems serious about it is Bernie Sanders. So let's go further. The Warren campaign's motto is, I have a plan for that. On climate, the Massachusetts senator has several. Warren has plans to eliminate the drilling on public lands, to decarbonize much of the U.S. military by 2030, to put America's public lands to use in the fight against climate change, to require companies to disclose the climate risks they're taking, to use trade policy to lower emissions, and to start a manufacturing boom in green industries. On Tuesday, she released an overarching proposal that also adopts key energy components from former climate candidate Jay Inslee's set of policies. Yes. She did this on Tuesday. I skimmed her plan as well. What cost does she place on this? She's going to do all this for $3 trillion over the next decade, an average of $300 billion per year. Is she kidding me? Is she kidding you? How is she going to do this while spending so little? How is she going to start a green manufacturing boom while spending over only $300 billion per year? That's not going to do it. It's a promise without substance. It's not a World War II scale effort. She promises millions of jobs, but I notice she doesn't say how many millions. She wants to ban fossil fuel drilling on public lands, supports a ban. Does she support a ban on drilling everywhere, on public or private lands? How about fracking? She supports a ban on public lands, but not on private lands. How about subsidies to fossil fuel companies? She supports a ban. Now, some people are going to say, well, she can't support a ban on fossil fuel drilling on lands the government doesn't own and on fracking. She can't support a ban on private lands the government doesn't own. How can she? That's not the private property of the federal government, not the property of the federal government. That interferes with the ownership rights of the companies. Look, the fossil fuel companies are engaged in interstate commerce. True. The federal government can prohibit any shipping of fossil fuels these companies might actually produce. That is, if there's any transportation that goes across the states, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution gives the government the right to regulate that commerce. So the government can ban fossil fuel drilling just by saying that any fossil fuels transported across state lines that have come from wells that were drilled on private lands can't be shipped. That's it. Ends the business. Same with fracking. The oil companies are dependent on interstate commerce to ship their fuels. Therefore, the federal government can regulate them any way they want to. I know that's going to be taken up by the Supreme Court, but handling the Supreme Court is a different problem. There are many ways of doing that. I'm not going to discuss that now. But that can be done by an administration that's determined to ban those. And whose administration would be the most actually determined to ban fossil fuel drillings and ban fracking? Well, it wouldn't be Warren's administration. That's for sure. It would be Bernie's administration. So what stands out? The Warren campaign plans are rooted in the senator's long-held belief that she wants to eliminate the corruptive influence of the fossil fuel companies in the political process. And she thinks that's the key to reforms that would be comprehensive. So what are the Wongs criticizing? Some on the left say Warren's calls for economic patriotism and restrictive intellectual property rules on clean energy technology risk slowing global decarbonization and unfairly profiting off countries that are hardest hit by the climate crisis. Look, it's a climate crisis. It's a matter of survival. So by all means, provide all the things we can possibly do to ensure that other companies survive. But letting those companies continue to be other than net zero with respect to the emissions of fossil fuels? No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We can't allow that. There are ways to do justice by compensating them for the harm that the Western world has done over the centuries. But there's no way that we can allow further risks to survival to exist. As far as the clean energy technology risks, slowing global decarbonization, what kind of clean energy technology are they talking about? I don't understand. There's no such thing as um, as a clean carbon technology. That's been proven now for a long time. Clean carbon is a myth. Clean carbon does not exist. Anyway, she wants to zero out emissions by 2028 for new buildings, by 2030 for new vehicles, and by 2035 for the electrical grid, as fast as possible economy wide. The ranking by advocates here: by Greenpeace, it's A minus, 350 Action, it's 3 thumbs up, and by Data for Progress, okay, it is very thorough. Yes, it's a thorough plan, but it seems to largely be based on the compulsion and very little on facilitation of the new industries we need in order to facilitate a green a New Deal. Yes, we must have these kinds of goals and compulsion to back them up, but without huge government spending to stimulate the greening of the economy, we're going to get nowhere. Sanders is talking 1.6 trillion per year over 10 years. Warren, in her revised plan, released just on Tuesday, okay, it improves on her earlier plan when she was going to spend only 2 trillion. Now she's up to 3 trillion. But 3 trillion is a fairy tale. She can't do what she's talking about here on $3 trillion, 300 billion a year over 10 years. That's never going to happen, folks. Then there is Andrew Yang, who said that it may be necessary for Americans to abandon the coast and head for higher ground, and that a universal basic income program like his would help to fund the relocation of people. This is crazy. 1,000 a month is going to help to overcome the relocation of people? That is nowhere near enough. Show me the simulations. Show me the simulations that show anything like that as a result, and I'll show you simulations fueled by false assumptions. This is a fairy tale. Try a job guarantee program. At least 3,000 a month. That would provide jobs for people when they abandon the coasts and head for higher ground. On day one, when they get there, try that. And try a BI for those who cannot work or who cannot but fit into a community defined a type of job guarantee program. Try having that kind of a basic income for people who don't want to go to the JG program, at a minimum of $2,000 a month. Try that. That will work a lot better to get people to abandon the coasts than his silly $1,000 a month is going to do. His climate plan is no different than the UBI plan in championing unusual policies. Specifically, he's the only major candidate to embrace geoengineering. Who would embrace a geoengineering plan? $4.87 trillion over 20 years. Let's be clear, folks. Warren is talking $3 trillion over 10 years. That's an average of more per year than Yang is calling for. All Yang is calling for is what? 2.45 trillion roughly over 10 years. It's less federal spending than Warren is advocating for. I notice also that Yang doesn't specify how many jobs that he's going to create. He doesn't support a ban on fracking. He supports a ban on fossil fuel drilling on public lands. He supports a ban on subsidies to fossil fuel companies. What stands out is the geoengineering plans. What the Wongs criticize is also geoengineering. He wants to zero out emissions by 2035 for the electrical grid, 2040 for the transportation sector, and 2049 for the full economy. Look, what counts is the full economy, and 2049 is far too late for the full economy. His ranking by advocates is C plus from Greenpeace, 2 thumbs up from 350 Action, and Data for Progress says it's a thorough plan. I wonder, on what basis. Now, they go over Bennett's plan here. I don't think it's worth actually spending time on that. And Bill de Blasio's plan, I don't think it's worth spending time on his plan because it's very unclear anyway. And what the Wonks are criticizing in terms, of Bill de Blasio is lack of details. And then there's the former Montana governor's plan. He doesn't support fracking. He doesn't support a ban on fossil fuel drilling on public lands. He's unclear about whether he supports subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And so Governor Bullock hasn't put forward a detailed proposal for anything, but he wants to zero out emissions by 2040, or earlier. He supported the Keystone XL. He dismisses the Green New Deal. He's not signing the no fossil fuel pledge, and the list goes on. Greenpeace gave him a D. The only question I have is why didn't they give him an F? 350 Action gave him three crosses. I guess that's a big failure. And John Delaney, his plan would cost $4 trillion, including $5 billion annually for negative emissions technology, including carbon capture, and a five-fold bump in funding for federal green energy program. Uh, his plan, okay, is another ridiculous plan. He supposedly has a unique approach to investing in carbon capture technology, and he makes a direct pitch to labor, particularly construction unions that have opposed efforts to eliminate fossil fuels. He gets a C minus. I have no idea why. From 350 Action, he gets two crosses, and Data for Progress says, okay, it's very incomplete. And then there's also Tulsi Gabbard. Uh, she proposed the Off Fossil Fuels Act in 2017, and she wanted, okay, to reach 100% renewable electricity by 2035. Her proposal won widespread praise in 2018, but now seems outdated in light of the Green New Deal. I don't know why, since uh, her act seems to be one that could be incorporated in the Green New Deal. Anyway, the summary points out that she's neither signed on to the Green New Deal nor released a full climate proposal of her own. So, what stands out? What stands out is that she lacks a detailed plan. Instead, her climate platform lists actions she's taken as a member, okay, of Congress. She wants to zero out emissions by 2035, but uh, uh, she's unclear concerning how that would be done. In other words, but she wants to go to having all our energy come from the renewables 100% by 2035. So Greenpeace gave her a B, 350 Action gives her two thumbs up, and Data for Progress hasn't said anything. Okay, Ryan, just extremely briefly, had a D plus, and 350 Action, okay, has given him I believe it was one thumbs up, or was it two thumbs up? Yes, it was one thumbs up. Even though Greenpeace, okay, has given Tom Steyer, okay, a D. His proposals on the climate are for little to set it apart from some, okay, the bigger name the contenders. He has costed his at $2 trillion. He's funded anti-fracking campaigns, okay, across the country. He hasn't said whether he'd support, okay, a ban on fracking. He supports a ban on drilling for fossil fuels. He supports a ban on subsidies to fossil fuel companies. He said his plan is going to produce jobs in the millions, and at least 1 million through a climate conservation corps. His proposals lack specifics, and he wants to declare a national emergency, which could open the door to potentially dangerous executive powers indeed. He wants to zero out emissions by 2045 and reduce asthma causing air pollution by 2030. So Greenpeace gives him a B plus, and also 350 action to 3 thumbs up, and Data for Progress says, okay, it's a thorough plan. Those rankings don't square with the summary, okay, that's given here, and you wonder why. Could it be that Steyer has contributed a good deal to Greenpeace and maybe some to 350 action too? I don't know. I didn't find Steyer's plan to be very detailed. It seems like the Marianne Williamson plan it stands out because she emphasizes cutting food waste and promoting plant-based diets, and better managing land are essential for limiting the warming of the planet. And she would also require corporations to commit to a series of emissions targets that get them to zero by 2050 or face fines. It's way too late. Way too late. Anyway, Greenpeace gave her a B. Who knows why? 350 Action gave her 3 thumbs up. And even though he's out of the race now, they put in, okay, an evaluation of Jay Inslee's plan. He put the cost at $9 trillion, with 3/4 coming from private investors. This, of course, compares with 16 trillion from Bernie, with 0 coming from the private investors. But with 16 trillion of government money going in, you might expect that there'd be another 20 trillion from private investors. I don't know, but with 3/4 coming from private investors, so what's that? $2.2 trillion coming from the federal government. 8 million jobs doesn't seem likely. What stands out? The entire package of plans clearly designated different federal agencies to take on the work. I don't think that's a very important feature of the plan. I'm sure Bernie knows extremely well which federal agencies would be involved in implementing his plan, and so do some others. Inslee's plans were held up as the gold standard, though in comparison to the Sanders proposal, some might say the government lacked revolutionary ambition. I'd say that. He wants to zero out emissions for most sectors by 2030, but economy-wide by 2050. The emissions are the emissions. They're emissions of greenhouse gases. They have to be eliminated. It has to be net zero. If it's 2030 for most sectors, but the rest of the sectors are emitting so much that the greenhouse gases are equivalent to what we have now, that does no good. And of course, a deadline of 2050 doesn't really mean very much. So for some reason, Greenpeace gives them an A minus, and 350 Action a 3 thumbs up. And Data for Progress says, okay, it's very thorough. I don't see these particular ratings. Okay, so where are we? We see that even those who have spoken very impressively about how serious the climate emergency is, have been underwhelming in their plans or have given cost estimates that are totally unrealistic. The only one who begins to give a hint of the cost involved is actually Bernie Sanders. The others try to mimic a state of strong commitment to the crisis, the emergency, but their plans don't reflect the seriousness of the problem. They all seem to be basically saying, well, me too, Bernie, but we're more fiscally responsible than you. We're going to do it on the cheap. Look at you. You're saying 16 trillion, and we're all saying only a fraction of that. And even those who are getting to 9 or 10 million or something like that are saying they're going to have a combination of public financing and private financing. So what's the pattern there? It's like in many, many other areas. It's as though Bernie Sanders comes out with a plan which is likely to solve a problem: free college, student debt, the Medicare for All plan, the infrastructure plans, okay, he's talked about, the job guarantee plan, the Green New Deal plan. All of these plans look like they have a chance of solving the major problem they are aimed at. And what are we getting from the other candidates? We're largely getting Me Too plans that talk about some similar things, but never go far enough and are totally unrealistic in their cost estimates. That's what we're seeing. Now, the $64,000 question is, or maybe it's the $64 trillion question is, what happened in relation to the climate crisis town hall tonight? Well, Buttigieg says combating climate could be more challenging than winning World War II. Well, that's nice. Then why is he proposing to spend so little on it compared to Sanders? So Warren has said she's rejected the idea. Tonight, she rejected the idea that Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, her fellow 2020 contender, was more committed to the climate change fight because he's willing to spend trillions more on the issue. No, Warren said bluntly, I've got plans. I have a $2 trillion plan. I have a $1 trillion plan, picking up how we're going to cut emissions by 70% by 2035. But we have to use all the tools in the toolbox. This is not a moment we just say, you know what, we just need to put some money on it and we'll fix it. Well, first of all, Bernie didn't say that. He outlined plans at least as detailed as Warren in his Green New Deal plan. And Warren admitted that combating climate change takes money. But she also added it takes more than that. Yeah, it does take more than that. And Bernie's got more than that. And she says we need to be willing to use the regulatory tools. That's important, she said. We have to use our position but internationally. And does Bernie disagree about that? Does he not think that we have to use our position but internationally? Does he not think that we have to regulate? In fact, in many, many cases, he would not simply regulate, he would just ban or end certain practices, whereas Warren would regulate. So, it is false to say that how much you're willing to spend on basically revolutionizing the energy producing and energy conservation industries and regenerative agriculture, that how much you're willing to spend on the societal transformation plans that are aimed at ending the climate emergency. It's ridiculous to say that a $16 trillion plan is not likely to be much more effective than a $3 trillion plan. I mean, think about it for a minute. If this is a World War II scale mobilization, do you think for a minute that we could have won World War II had we spent 1/5 of what we ended up actually spending? And make no mistake, someone who proposed a $2 or $3 trillion plan, who could have proposed a $16 trillion plan, but started out with a $2 trillion plan and then moved it up to a $3 trillion plan. If you think that that person is as committed to and serious about transforming society in a way that's necessary to win this war on the climate emergency, is as serious about that as someone who starts out talking about spending $16 trillion, I think you really need to have your head examined. It seems to me the person who starts out with a $16 trillion bid is the one more serious about using all the tools in the toolbox, especially when he's not a person who's at all shy when it comes to regulation, or when it comes to leading other nations internationally. Do you really think Bernie is going to be passive about that? Who's likely to be more active in leading the international community? Is it Senator Warren or is it Senator Sanders? I mean, come on, folks. Who has the greater influence, for example, in the UK? Who has the greater influence in Europe right now? Is it Senator Warren or is it Senator Sanders? I think the answer is certainly Senator Sanders. And about Warren's trade and foreign policy, including climate elements. Her trade policies appear to be pretty much free trade policies. I don't see her departing from the mainstream when it comes to trade policy. If we want to talk about someone who's going to do that, it's again going to be Bernie Sanders. It's not going to be Warren. Anyway, so that's what we see here in these summaries. Okay. Okay. So Warren has things to say to workers in the oil industry. And she said she'd had two things she wants to tell the workers in the oil industry, the fossil fuel industries. And she says there are going to be many jobs in Port Arthur over the next 20 years. And she has other very general things to say. But she doesn't have programs for employing these people that are at all specific. Bernie Sanders has both. Warren wants tough rules for the utilities, but not actually public ownership of the utilities. Last time I checked, but TVA was still doing very well. And Warren says if somebody wants to make a profit from building better solar panels and from generating battery storage, I'm not opposed to that. I'm sure Bernie is not opposed to that either. But it's not a question of whether they want to make a profit from it. It's a question of whether they will invest in it or not. Warren says we've got to have tough rules. Again, Bernie also has tough rules in mind. Warren said Wednesday that conversations around regulating light bulbs, banning plastic straws, and cutting down on red meat are exactly what the fossil fuel industry wants people focused on as a way to distract from their impact on climate change. So, is this a comparison with Bernie somehow? Is this a comparison that suggests that her program for climate change is better than Bernie's? And then, of course, she criticized Trump and what he's doing. And Warren is against building any nuclear power plants. Again, that doesn't at all distinguish her, okay, from Bernie. So Bernie was asked on Wednesday night which policy of all those he thinks are important he would push first if he was elected, but he did not put one before any of the others. He said, I have the radical idea that a sane Congress can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. The way to make it all happen, he argued, is to elect lawmakers that support his platform. You betcha. That's Bernie. It's all about the revolution. It's all about changing the situation. It's not about small ball politics and doing priorities to prioritize one necessary thing over another necessary thing. It's about getting the lawmakers in who will decide to pass what is right for the public, what is in accord with the public purpose, what is in accord with our need for survival. It is finally having a government which represents working families and the middle class rather than wealthy campaign contributors, Sanders said. When you do that, things fall into place. And so Bernie was also talking about curbing population growth through birth control as a key part of his climate plan. He pointed out the planet cannot sustain this growth. That's what one voter said while asking the question. Sanders said he would do something about the growth, and he turned the conversation to women's rights. And he said women in the United States, by the way, have a right to control their own bodies and make reproductive decisions. And on rolling back Trump's climate change moves, he said, duh. And he added, look, one of the great things that's happening and gives us hope is that there's been an explosion in technology in many, many areas, that if we have the political will to utilize that technology, we can maybe save the planet. And of course, he criticized Trump a lot, the low hanging fruit, okay, of the town hall. But the point is, to some degree, the town hall was governed by the questions from the voters. So here's an important question. Who selected, who selected who would be uh, who the voters who would be able to submit their questions? What was the selection process? Why did Bernie get a question which basically asked, are you for birth control? I mean, why? Well, okay, at least he doesn't seem to have gotten the question of how you're going to pay for it, or at least that wasn't highlighted by CNN in their summaries of what had happened. And Biden said, we can take millions of vehicles off the road if we have high speed rail. Well, that's great, of course, but Bernie is for high speed rail. And how is Biden going to pay for it? And Biden explained why he would not support a nationwide fracking ban on Wednesday. Because he doesn't believe any measure banning fracking could pass. That's because he doesn't believe that he could revolutionize the Congress, right? Isn't that so? Those of us who are for the revolution would beg to differ with him. He says he doesn't believe there are enough votes to get it done. Well, not in the present federal government, but the whole point of this election is to change the freaking federal government. Okay, so that was the tenor of the kind of thing that went on during the climate forum. We had some nonsense statements from Klobuchar, who basically said uh, that she was going to restore the regulations and she was going to regulate in a serious way. And who called the Amazon fires a tragedy. And she said she would try to leverage with allies and make a big difference in trying to put pressure and working with nonprofits and other groups all over the world to try to stop this. She knows it's very dangerous, and what does she want to do to try to stop it? She wants to work with nonprofits across the world. Yeah. And she's going to roll back Donald Trump's changes to the gas mileage standards. And she's going to raise that. No promises about net zero emissions here. No further promises. Harris is going to empower communities that have been ignored. And she touted her founding of an environmental justice unit during her time as district attorney in San Francisco. She said, okay, a decision, she said, that came partly in response to the pollution of a nearby area with a low household income, which diminished the ability to rally political support for its cause. She says, there's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. And Harris wanted to ban plastic straws and says paper straws need to be perfected. Well, I'm for banning plastic straws too. Does anybody think that is not going to receive some little amount of attention from in a Sanders plan? So Harris is going to tell the DOJ to go after the fossil fuel companies. I'm sure she's going to put a lot of people from the fossil fuel companies in jail, right? When in California, she let the rich go free and settled for civil penalties, slaps on the wrists for companies, while she put thousands of violators of the crime bill into jail. In the heavy majority, people of color. One thing that was good that she said is that she would abolish the filibuster if the Republicans stand in the way of legislation to combat climate change. Well, what about simply backing the end of the filibuster because it might block some other great things? Like, for example, ending student debt. For example, passing a Medicare for All bill. For example, by passing the Job Guarantee Act. Why is the filibuster so sacred that you would only get rid of it when it comes to passing a green New Deal? So that's what came out of her town hall. Oh, by the way, she got a questioner who was bound to play softball with her, and that questioner, that particular questioner, okay, was Aaron Burnett, who's a but neoliberal, just like Harris. I won't go into what Yang has said, but the basic point here is that the sequential town hall sessions that we had tonight from CNN did not really add much to the pre-debate summaries that were given with respect to the candidate. It appears from the summaries here, okay, of what they said in their sessions, that Andrew Yang gave a good account of himself, except when he really didn't provide a particular plan about how to move people away from the coasts. In other words, that may not be a bad idea given the scale of the crisis, but it is certainly the case, that if we're going to move people away from the coasts, there are going to have to be many more $1 trillion in this plan than has been estimated so far by Mr. Yang, for sure. So Yang said some pretty good things here. He gave a better account of himself than Harris did, and a better account of himself than many other people. But his plans to use technology are still somewhat vague, and it's not clear how they articulate at all with his cost estimates. Uh, Julian Castro's plans also look like they're very vague, and he would not push a federal fracking ban. I mean, come on. How can you be serious about the climate emergency and not have the federal government actually ban fracking? You can't. That's not serious. If you're not willing to ban fossil fuel drilling and fracking, I mean, you are nowhere. And of course, as we know, Castro would not spend very much. That has not changed in this particular town hall. So again, the general pattern emerges. That pattern is people are willing to use a lot of rhetoric to say how serious the problem is and how much of an emergency, okay, it is. But there's no one who starts out willing to spend, okay, an amount of money on the Green New Deal that even begins to approach the scale of what we're routinely spending on defense right now, or what we're routinely spending on healthcare right now. In terms of amount we're willing to spend on this emergency which threatens our very survival. There is no one except for Bernie Sanders who's beginning to step up to the plate, and I've already explained why even what Bernie is saying vastly underestimates the amount of money that will have to be spent on this. These cost estimates are not realistic, but even more unrealistic is somebody coming up and saying, look, the cost estimates are irrelevant. If we don't do what needs to be done to solve this problem of climate change, we are done as a species. The earth might be done as a repository of life. I mean, money can be no object in this respect, especially not for a nation whose constitution places no limits on the amount of money that Congress can create. We have to keep this in front of our minds at all times. We have the power to pay what we need to pay for. It's not a question of money. It's not a question of cost. It's a question of availability of the resources. The labor resources, the technology resources, the intellectual resources, all of those things, and the political resources, the political commitment to solving this existential problem. It's an existential problem, folks. It doesn't matter what BS cost estimates these people put forward, except insofar as it allows us to evaluate who's serious about this and who's not. Now, I put to you that Warren isn't serious about this. I also put to you that Tulsi Gabbard, who I like in many, 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 many ways, is not serious about this. Why has not she put forward a more comprehensive climate plan? Where is it? What kind of commitment would she put in back of it? Anyway, that's what I have to say about this. There's only one candidate that is coming close to stepping up to the bar. And even though I may doubt the specific estimates he gave, I don't doubt that he knows it's a matter of survival, and he will have the government spend whatever he thinks it needs to spend to solve this problem. He will do that. So now I'm going to leave this, and I'm going to consider your comments and questions and any brickbats you want to throw at me. Okay, here we are back at Facebook. Jason Bessie has joined. Russell Gorman said he got to go at 10 p.m. See you soon. Sunday Descalia joined. Hey, Sunday. I don't know if you're still here, but thank you for coming. Margaret Shepard said, it's clear to me, spend the money or die. Yeah, spend the money or die. And we have the power to spend the money. I mean, we have the Constitution. Allows us to create that money and to spend it. Okay. My daughter Devaris says, disabled people with movement issues do better with plastic straws. Many of them are starting to invest in silicone and metal, though. I think for disabled people, it would be a very simple matter for the federal government, okay, to provide them with silicone straws. That would not be a serious matter. I think it would be a minor expenditure. Okay, so any other comments or questions? While I'm waiting, please share, like, and subscribe this post. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com, or is it patreon.com? I never know. /Joe_Firestone. And thank you for coming tonight. And thank you for any comments or shares you've already done. And thank you for the likes and hearts and such. I appreciated it. I'm not sure what I'll be doing tomorrow night. I meant to talk about the financial sustainability. Lana says, thanks for the comparison info. Sure, not just the info, but I hope also the evaluation. Anyway, I was originally set out to talk about the key to a sustainable economy is 5,000 years old. I think that's a very provocative kind of topic, and I will get to it as soon as I can. But speaking realistically here, it might be necessary to do some more evaluations and some more comparisons tomorrow based on the reaction to this particular forum. I call your attention again, though, to the fact that the forum was set up in such a way by CNN that it gave them a very free hand to use non transparent decision making on their part to funnel certain questions and not others to the candidates, and to spotlight certain candidates, okay, and not other candidates. To introduce, in other words, into this process all kinds, okay, of bias that suit them as a private company, that suits the interests that they have as a private company in terms of who they think should win the presidency this time around. It's very apparent that that is the lens which they use to look at things, and that they're constantly putting their thumb on the scale. And if you think they didn't do that tonight in ways we don't yet understand, then I think you, Kate, are kidding yourself. I have to say, from the original summaries, it doesn't seem like they were working against Bernie in too tough a manner but tonight. But I think they might have been trying to stack the cards towards Biden and Harris and Warren. So I think it might have been more on the favorable side with respect to those three. I haven't had a chance to look at what they had to say about Mr. Buttigieg yet. There are four new updates that I failed to consider here. I didn't actually take account, okay, of Beto, okay, at all. His climate town hall has just started. And so Mr. Buttigieg defended his decision to fly private plane, okay, to go places in relation to decarbonizing. He was very much for improving the train systems, though. He said that if places, okay, from Indianapolis to South Bend and Detroit and so on, were just a few hours away from each other by train, he said that would be great. That okay, it would mean a lot for those areas. But he also said he's not even asking for Japanese level trains. He said, just give me Italian level trains. Amazing, just Italian level trains. Buttigieg started talking about the moral dimension of things and also the religious dimension of things. And he asked, One doesn't have to be religious to see the moral dimensions of this, because frankly, every religious and also non religious kind, okay, of moral tradition tells us we have some responsibility for stewardship, some responsibility for taking care of what's around us, oh, not to mention taking care of our neighbor. And he said a few other nice things. He did not say, oh, he criticized Trump and said he was going to be remembered the most for his failure on the climate. I think that, but he's probably also going to be remembered most for his efforts to try to convert this country into a fascist or quasi fascist state. So Buttigieg, it seems, was treated very well by CNN. Of course, I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but based on the summary remarks, it seems like he wasn't asked about the details of his climate plan, okay, at all. I mean, what were they doing? I wonder. Seems to me Mayor Pete got let off easy. Easy. Beto is up now. And I can't stay for the end, okay, of Beto, I'm afraid. So I'll have to leave that for future shows. Any further comments after Lana Dell's last one? No, no further comments. So since there aren't any further comments, I think that I'm going to call it a night. Okay, once again, I thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to leave now.